So this project has a couple of different parts to it, and I wasn't exactly sure what you all were interested in hearing about, so I'm going to talk a little bit about all of them. The tours that I'm leading through the section of Avondale that was a historic Black settlement. So that tour is a narrative amalgamation of all this research that I've been doing over the last 3 years into the Avondale neighborhood. And obviously it doesn't encapsulate everything that one could know. There are still some loose threads and some things that I may never know, just because there's no legible record of them to be found. But what drew me to the neighborhood was a minor mention on your website, the Avondale Neighborhood Association website, that the first house of worship in Avondale was an AME church. And that was a short article about the history of Avondale that was written by Dan Pogozowski. Are you all familiar with Dan?
We all know
Yeah, he's pretty active. Sorry, I'm getting a little hot. And so, you know, a lot of people know that AME means African Methodist Episcopal, and if it's the late 19th, early 20th century, they must live in the area, and so I just became fascinated with this point and have been digging at it ever since. So what brought me to look at that was I was researching the Negro Motorist Green Book prior to this, which you may know because of that movie that came out.
The Green Book?
The Green Book was it's a really fascinating document. It was published from the 1930s to the 1960s, one a year. It came out of New York City, and it was published by a postal worker, Victor Green, and his wife Alma, and eventually grew to include all 50 states, and it was a directory of places where black drivers could stop because Jim Crow was legal. It's perfectly legal to discriminate against people. How would you know where you can go unless you have some sort of guide? And I was going through the Chicago listings and quickly realized that most likely as a result of it being published out of New York at a distance, it didn't have, it only had a fraction of the places that would have been in for Chicago. So I started looking at what could have been missing. And because I lived in Avondale, still do, at the time, I decided to see, let me just see if anything pops up, and that's what came up was this ANA article, right? Sorry, let me look at my notes. So that map, that green map that I passed out, is a collage that I made. The black portion, like literally the color black, is from a map that was drawn by an architect as it was narrated to him by a man named John Steeman. John Steeman was a longtime Avondale resident. He moved here in 1881, and he was a teacher, and he ran this little one-room schoolhouse for decades. So Steeman, 50 years after the fact, is recalling what the neighborhood looked like, and an architect is drawing it for him. And on that map, he highlights a colored section, right? You can kind of see it on there. And there are other things too. There's a haunted house. Yeah. He names a lot of, the Garrett family is named on that map. It's not on your copy because I just have a section of it, but it's on there. What he doesn't do is he doesn't name any of the individual black families that are there. And another thing he misses, and that's where the Milwaukee dividing line on the other side, that map comes from a 1902 real estate map, and it shows the Dawson settlement, right? Dawson settlement was huge. It started as 7 acres and it only grew. And John Brown Dawson, moved to, I'm sorry, let me jump ahead here. He was born on the banks of the Ohio River in Wellsburg in what is now West Virginia in 1819. In 1820, he and his parents were listed as free colored persons on the census, right? So he was already free prior to the Civil War. He was a barber, and although he was a very successful barber, he had loftier goals. He became a minister of the gospel, ordained by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and with evangelical zeal, he headed west to Illinois. So 1856, Dawson had already moved to Illinois. He's described as a trailblazer and a toiler in church records, and he definitely traveled through the region, establishing many AME churches. We know for a fact that he was in Quincy, Illinois at one point. He was in Davenport, Iowa, kind of up and down the rivers, which is very common at the time. There were a lot of small black settlements in those areas. And then this is coming directly from the tour I give, so sorry if it feels a little disjointed because we're sitting here and not walking around. But beyond the spiritual, serving the Lord also meant an active involvement in the freedom struggle for all black people. So Dawson is here, he's in Chicago. In 1858, he was the founding president of the Colored People's Savings Institution of Chicago. He was dedicated to economic empowerment. During the war years, Dawson was a prominent and outspoken supporter of abolition and President Lincoln. He was one of the principal members of the Committee on Friends of Emigration to Haiti, which was a cause taken up by the AME Church in solidarity with black people everywhere. And so post-war, talking post-Civil War, as Chicago continued to grow, Dawson wanted more than just another church. You know, he'd been traveling all around. He wanted a place that he could build a community. And by 1870, he was in a position economically to make that happen. So after the Great Chicago Fire, October 1871, I'm sure everybody knows that, Dawson purchased 7 acres of land in the newly platted town of Avondale, which was largely empty except for a few developments along the Plank Road, which was, Milwaukee was known as the Old Plank Road because of the way that it was made, right? They would grade the road, put down gravel, lay down logs, and then put planks perpendicular to those logs to make a good sturdy road. So in 1873, jumping ahead just a few years, Dawson had settled in a house on the south side of Milwaukee, just north of Diversey. And Dawson Street over there is actually named for John Dawson. His sons would, in fact, 20 years later, run a barbershop right there at the intersection of Dawson and Milwaukee. And then if you jog over to Allen Avenue, so it's 2 streets north from Dawson, if you're looking at that Milwaukee strip. So there are conflicting reports about Allen. Okay, I'm sorry, let me go back. A lot of the streets are named for wealthy people and developers, right? So you have Dawson is named after him. Allen Avenue, I'm not entirely sure who Allen is named for, but in the 40s, and this is on the other side of that map, if you flip it over, there was this letter written to the Chicago Public Library in the 40s by a woman who
40s
was...
being 1840s or
1940s.
Okay.
By a woman whose family was one of these early black settlers, and she's asking the library to look into families other than the Dawson family. Apparently they were doing some survey of Dawson because he was such a dynamic character and made such an impact. And she's saying, if you're gonna do a survey, do a thorough one or none at all. And in that letter, she calls out Allen as being one of the streets named after one of those black families. I haven't found anything else to confirm this, so, you know, who knows, it's an exciting little bit of information. But, okay, so back to Dawson and his settlement. By 1880, so the year before Steeman came and was drawing this map, the Dawson settlement had grown to include 71 black residents. and his settlement made up about 2/3 of the black residents listed in Jefferson Township that census year in 1880. And in 1883, so 2 years after Stevens recollecting this map, Dawson was elected delegate from Jefferson Township to the Republican Party State Convention in Springfield. So you have to remember at the time the Republicans were the party of Lincoln, they were the abolitionists, right? And when Dawson passed in 1898, so sadly not that long after, the estate that his widow inherited included the triangle north of Diversey, south of Milwaukee, all the way to Central Park, right? It's pretty big. And adjacent land west of Central Park to Ridgeway north of George, which isn't even on that map, really. But it's past Moe's Tavern and the Podlasie Club, if you know those guys. Julia, his widow, Julia Dawson, was still living in their home west of Central Park in the 1900 census, while their son Thaddeus settled with his family, his wife and 4 children on Ridgeway. But also by 1900, the number of inhabitants had begun to decline, so you had 65 people, 65 black people living in Jefferson Township, and that was about half of all of the black inhabitants. Between 1901 and 1906, Julia, John's widow, sold off most of their property. I'm not entirely sure. She probably just needed money to live. Over the course of 5 years, she was a widow, right? Many of the original families relocated to the south side, and in fact, only Thaddeus and a few others, a handful of others, would continue to live out their life in the Avondale Logan Square area. Thaddeus ended up living right behind where the owl is in Logan Square, you know, right behind the owl until he passed away. And by 1910, 70% of all black Chicagoans lived south of downtown. So, I mean, there's probably a lot of social dynamics that go into play for why this relocation happened. I'm still looking for any hard evidence. That letter that's on the back was written by a woman named Frances Graham. She was born in Illinois in 1896. She's a black woman. Her and her husband owned their home in 1940, and we know this from the census. And right around that time, you know, she writes that letter to the Chicago Public Library about making the survey. And they were the only black family living, one of the only black families living in the neighborhood, and certainly the only one on that block. But it was a mixed block. So her neighbors at 2914 Allen were a Chinese family renting. A couple doors down at 2928, there was a Polish family that was renting to 2 additional Polish families. And in 2930 Allen, there was a Czechoslovakian family who was also renting to another family. So it was a very mixed block. What else? The Allen Chapel is on there, and so that's on Allen Street as well. I believe the chapel's named after the street and not the other way around. Again, still looking for information. And the other kind of highlight of the tour that I point out is by 1920, the Dawson settlement families had been reduced to 1 family. So Thaddeus had moved basically to Logan Square. In Avondale, you had a woman named Laura Good and her 2 children. They were the last ones left. And her grandson, Robert Lucas, would grow up to be an accomplished writer, getting his start with the WPA, Illinois Writers Project, and eventually writing for the Chicago Defender, the LA Sentinel, and he was an editor for Jet magazine. And so that's the Dawson settlers. The only other black resident that I know of from all of this other research between like 1920 and 1970 or so was Lucy Parsons, who was the widow of Albert Parsons, the anarchist martyr of the 1886 Haymarket Affair. She herself was a world-famous agitator for racial and social justice, and she was living just a little further north on Troy according to the 1940 census, so this is 1940. But Lucy had always, so we have her name and we have her address, but she'd always been very light-skinned and slightly ambivalent about what her race was when anyone would ask her, so they actually marked her as white on the census. And today the site of that home that was on Troy is buried by the Kennedy Expressway. Yeah, and that's roughly where, so I've installed a billboard in the neighborhood, it's roughly where the billboard is. Yeah. Yeah.
I was gonna let you know too, I don't know if there's that new mural that went on in the northeast corner, actually has Lucy Perkins is the woman that's identified in the corner.
Cool.
Yeah.
I don't
Because I think they named Kedzie honorary Lucy Perkins Way.
Cool.
So how much context did the Chicago History Museum provide? Did they provide anything? Do they have anything on this?
They, not really, not so much on this. It's a lot of digging. The History Museum has some really great maps that you can look at. A lot of this came from a couple of places. So Dan introduced me to a historian from the DePaul Library, and she was looking into this community, particularly the research around John Dawson. I had kind of, he would not call himself a historian, but he's very savvy with looking at like Ancestry.com and doing that sort of research, and published an article about the Dawsons in the Illinois Genealogical Society newsletter, and I used a lot of that. What else? Just talking to people. The Sulzer Regional Library has a North Side collection.
Okay.
That has a lot of things in it. That was actually more useful to me than the History Museum.
Okay.
For this particular
Which one?
project. The Sulzer on Lincoln Avenue, kind of up there in Lincoln Square. They were given a Northside collection that has a ton of stuff about Logan Square, Avondale.
That's interesting.
I have two questions.
Yeah,
I mean, we have, so I know we only have usually like.
Are you doing a walk?
I mean, so
Hey, are you doing a walk tomorrow?
I am, so I am giving a walk tomorrow at noon. We're gonna meet at Wellington and Berry, is that right?
No,
Yes,
Albany.
Wellington and Berry, over there by
Right.
Small Bar.
no,
Albany.
Wellington, Albany.
Albany, sorry, thank you.
So the mystery of them leaving is still unsolved.
Yes.
Yeah, that was gonna be my question.
Okay.
Why did they leave? Why did everybody leave?
Well, I don't have a solid answer for that.
You have
I'm still looking
speculation?
for information.
Are you speculating?
I prefer not to at this time. I have a couple of theories, but I don't really know.
Who knows at that time?
I mean, it makes me kind of. I mean, we don't have time because we
Sorry,
spend
yes, what
hours
was your
on.
question?
But like,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think I would say that like for me, what comes up for me is like, I wonder how. I mean, this is one of many stories that we don't know, right? And so it makes me think about like kind of the neighborhood's history and kind of the dynamics, and also around working with people of color and people of color histories, and like. So I just have a lot of things that you're making me think of that I hope also sparks like internal conversation amongst us as neighbors. And I'm kind of thinking, I mean, I have so many questions, maybe you can come back and share some more thoughts, but I'm thinking about like one, like what happens to the project or your research next. I'm really curious about that. Second thing I'm thinking about is how do we preserve the history now? And third, I think that comes up for me is like, how do we continue acknowledging and celebrating like racial ethnic diversity within this neighborhood, right? Because we know that neighborhoods change and like there are very real systemic racial issues, right? That are probably the reasons why they were not acknowledged and blah blah blah. But the point is like I'm just making me think of all these layers that I hope maybe you can come back or continue to engage us around or as you continue to learn more about like your research. But is there kind of like a kind of a like trajectory of kind of what you're imagining this project to
So definitely right now, concrete moving forward steps. There is a website that's listed on that flyer. It's justok.com, and I'm updating that with information and maps and things as time goes on. I've been a little busy these last couple weeks, but it's coming. And there's also a feedback form on there. So if anyone has anything that they want to tell me, or comments, or anything, it's on there. I am also working with an organization. This project has been funded by Three Walls, and they're going to work with me after the run of the billboard to publish a book about the project. So there are all these kind of, yeah. Yes.
And I think like for us, I'm gonna share with our neighbors here that like I think it's really crucial to support projects like this, and also to like, and that may manifest in different ways, right? Like
Yeah.
maybe like some of the folks who've been here can share like or have history or have like leads. Too, obviously, like it's a lot of work and time and energy.
Yeah.
And so like if resources in that capital are available, I think that's really important. And also like for you to come back and engage with us about the dream of this project and beyond. Because I don't think I think the reason you're getting a lot of attention, right, a lot of requests is because it's something that we don't hear often. And those stories are varied, right?
Yeah, there's a desire for it, which is great. You know, everybody's really
Yeah,
pleasantly
you've really
surprised.
discovered something.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I know, son, you got Ellen Avenue, towards Milwaukee, you got that house over there. And the story I heard when I was a kid, there was a Mrs. Ellen who was a colored woman, who they asked her permission to build the street down through her property, Ellen Avenue, and they would name it after her, and she wouldn't have to pay taxes for the rest of her life.
Oh.
And I thought it was that short little squatty house that was still there on the west side of the street since I last went past.
The little greenhouse, maybe?
I'm a little colorblind.
Okay, no.
It's
Where
on
did
the
you
north
hear
side
that
of the
story?
Probably in the late 1950s, 1960s or something. And I know I was in Avondale school, and they have a map on the wall from like 1865, and they showed this area for colored people. And I thought that was, pretty interesting, something I didn't know. And what year is this map from?
So this one was actually drawn.
1881.
It's of 1881, but it wasn't drawn until 1936. So he's remembering 1881. Yeah, 50 years later, right?
So, Nia, I have a question.
Yeah.
What, did I hear you say you live in Avondale?
I live in Avondale.
Oh, Avondale. Oh, you
Yeah.
live in that. Okay, I was
Yeah,
gonna
yeah,
say,
yeah.
what drew
On
you?
Longdale.
On Longdale. Oh,
Yeah.
on Longdale. Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering what drew you to this particular direction. this
Yeah,
topic.
well, that was over here, right? And so I was looking at the green book and I noticed things were missing, and then I thought I'd start in my own backyard and
Yeah.
struck gold.
The stories in the Avondale, those black and white books that talk about the history of different neighborhoods around the city,
Mhm.
that story is in that book.
There,
Yeah.
which,
What's you said
The
you
Polish village, Avondale and the Polish village, with Dan and.
yeah, there's a tiny
There's a
bit
tiny
in there.
little bit there.
It doesn't say a lot.
So,
He mentions the Allen Church
right.
and Dawson.
So I'm curious, how has been the reaction at the church over there about,
Well, the church
Knowing-
doesn't exist.
oh, it doesn't exist anymore?
No,
Oh, I
it's
thought it
not
still
there.
did.
No,
And the one they
there are a
moved to
couple of
Brunswick?
residential houses and there's a big empty lot.
Oh.
And I'm not sure if the church was on where the empty lot is or if it was on where one of the houses is.
So there's nothing in history about when they moved to the south side?
No.
Oh,
And I'm
okay.
trying to also see if, so if I can get enough of the names and figure out if enough of the people moved to the same congregation together, that would be a huge clue. There are so many churches on the south side, it's like, going through them all is just very time consuming, and I haven't found one in particular, if that indeed migrated in that fashion.
Okay.
I was just gonna suggest too, because we do have a lot of people who've lived in the neighborhood a long time. If there's
Yeah.
particular questions, kind of like here where like people lived in the neighborhood a while, maybe they at least have some things they've heard of, that we'd be happy to post something on Facebook or through our network to just say, hey, have you ever heard anything about the history of this street or this person or this
Cool.
name?
Yeah.
That maybe we could just crowdsource. I know it's not historic data, but then you could sort of try to do a little more
kind of parse
research.
through it.
Yeah.
All of
Yeah.
that,
Fact check the anecdotal
Mhm.
stories.
exactly,
Yeah.
and no, that would be great. Yeah.
There's a Lucy Parsons Park
Where?
40, it's a block east of Cicero on Belmont.
Yeah, that, yeah.
Yeah, Lucy Parsons Park, they just built it about 5 years ago.
Oh, no kidding.
Oh, I know where you're talking about.
Yeah,
It's
Yeah,
a
you
little
need to
teeny
realize
weeny
Yeah.
that.
park.
Yeah.
It has a nice little.
It's got a little sign up in front of Lucy Parsons.
It's
Awesome.
just east
Yeah.
of Keating.
Awesome, thank you.
Where is it at?
It's Keating, just east of Keating on Belmont.
Oh, okay.
About 4,700, I think.
Close to like by where the Tonys is, but.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just,
I'm just
it's
looking at
between
that now.
Tony's,
It's
it's
just past
between the
the Tonys.
Tonys and Cicero.
Yeah.
On
Oh,
that-
Yeah.
that little park right
On that
there.
north side.
yeah, that little park.
On Belmont, yeah.
I think
on
there's
Belmont.
a senior citizen's house
Yeah,
right
yeah,
across
across
the
the
street,
street.
yeah.
Take a picture and send it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We wanna be mindful of your time.
Yeah,
So
'cause
any
you know you
maybe
said you gotta
one
be
final
some-
question or comment before we move on to the next.
Neil, I
Thank
have
you.
one more suggestion.
Sure.
We have about 4 or 5 seniors at the Avondale Block Club that are in their 90s with great memories. One passed away about 4 months ago, and I did a 2-hour video with him, telling me about the neighborhood and where he played and what he did, and they have great recollection. They might not remember back to 1800, but 90 years ago, that's quite a distance for some,
Yeah.
with good memory.
Yeah, that'd be
One is Sam Costco. Sam Costco lives on Kimball, right next to the bus turnaround there. And if you get Sam talking, he will tell you things that you can't find in a book.
I have a lot of time when you talk to me.
Yeah, have a, right. That's right, have a lot of time.
What is the best way to,
Call me, I'll give you, I'm gonna see you tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow, and he might join us. I'll get him to join us.
Thank you so much.
Yes, no,
Thank
thank
you.
you.